to read them. And it's important for everyone to know, as this is a public meeting, that the reports are also published on the internet. So with that in mind, let me please just take a moment to talk about how, with this virtual meeting, we would like to conduct it. So as with most virtual meetings, it would be very helpful, please, if you would just speak only when invited. And as chair, I will do my utmost to take a look to see people who have indicated that they wanted to speak by raising the hand symbol that you will have available on your screen. And members of the public who may be with us are welcome to view the proceedings, but members of the public should not make contributions at the meeting. I'd like you, and I can see most people have done this, so that's good news. It really does help with background interference to minimize that if you mute your microphone and as much as possible video feeds when you're not speaking. And then just please do try to remember to unmute when it's your turn to speak, when I indicate for you to speak. And if we can't hear you, I will just let you know so that we can proceed without any undue delays. So please, if you'd like to speak, if you would just use the hand symbol, raise your hand, and then I will indicate when it's your turn, and we'll proceed accordingly. If you don't have a hand button or you're struggling to find it, there's also a chat facility. So we'll take it, I'll keep an eye on that, keep an eye on the chat facility, and you can indicate there. So we hope we don't have any problems with technology, but you never know. Any kinds of disruptions, dogs barking or anything like that, I hope everyone will be patient if any of those things happen throughout the course of this evening. Okay, that takes us through the announcement. I'd like now to move on. I don't have specific introductions to make this evening. The papers do show the attendance list and the distribution list of many people who are here. And so I think that we'll just go straight to apologies. And I do understand, Karen will add to this if she has more to add. I do understand that we have received apologies from Mr. Minot and Mr. McConomy. I'm just going to pause to ask Karen if you have any other apologies.
Yes, Chair, we've also received apologies from Mrs. Hannaway.
Thank you, Karen. I'm not aware of any substitutes, but again, I'll bring Karen in case she's been notified of any at the last moment. Karen, any substitutes?
No, Chair.
I've just received an email that's popped up on my screen. I believe we have apologies also from Councillor Ruth Buttery. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. We'll move on to agenda item 5, which is to approve the minutes of the meeting held on the 17th of November. And what I'd like to do first is to go through those minutes for matters of accuracy. And then once we've taken care of that business, we can approve them before moving on to matters arising. So I'll just indicate by page number. And if you do have a matter of accuracy, just matters of accuracy to start with, please, if you could indicate by raising your hand. So the minutes begin on page 18 of the papers. Do we have any matters of accuracy on page 18, please? Page 19. Page 20. Page 21. Page 22. Page 23. Page 24. Page 25. Page 26. Page 27. Page 28. I'm just going to thank you. My vice chair, Jill, were you trying to indicate something or not? Jill Belcher. Did you have a point to make, Jill? Just unmute, Jill, if you did. Jill, I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Chair, I don't know whether there's she's suffering with technical difficulties because she keeps coming in and out of the lobby.
Okay.
So whether that might have popped up.
Fine, thank you. Okay, I hope Jill is able to solve those problems, but we'll move on. Okay, we're going to go through for some matters arising now with the minutes from the 17th of November. And I'd like to begin with just a few matters arising, and I will open up if colleagues have other matters. But if I can please to start, if I can direct you to page 19, item 32. And under item 32, which was the matters arising from the previous set of minutes, we do have second paragraph, you will note, in relation to the Dudley's approved capital schemes, that there's an update there. So I'm going to hand over to Stacy, who will take us through an update there as a matter arising. So can I hand over to Stacy, please?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Yes, it's just a brief update just to let you know that we'll be bringing a report on the 2nd of March meeting to go through the capital maintenance grant and give you an update on that. And we will also be covering the capital earmarked reserves for maintained schools. And then what we'll do is part of my budget setting report that comes to the end of March meeting on the 31st of March, I'll give you an update on the remaining capital grants. That will cover all the areas then that Forum might want information on capital. Thank you.
Thank you, Stacey. You cut out right at the end for me anyway, but I think we do have the gist of what you're saying, and we will have future updates on the 2nd of March and the 31st of March. So thank you for that. On the same page, please, for further matters arising, at the bottom of page 19, the final paragraph, in relation to the unspent reserves with a dedicated schools grant totaling £45,000. We aren't going to cover this in item 9, so I'm going to ask Helen Ellis if she'd come in and just have a quick word there. Helen, over to you.
Yeah, it was a question that was asked at the last schools forum, if members recall, and it's just to say that the £45,000 currently is not allocated.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay. So hope that update is useful. Now, as chair, I would like to just draw attention to item 33 on the top of page 20. And as part of the feedback from the budget working group in November, there was reference to the discussions on the proposed disapplication request to the Secretary of State. And clearly item 37 of the minutes was our substantive item on the disapplication request. And that begins on page 22 of your papers, and they are related. So if you will bear with me, I'd like to just make a comment about that. Some members of Forum will be aware that in December there were some email exchanges around the disapplication process. So I do think it's important in the interests of transparency and collaborative working that I take a moment just to pause here and really just confront this issue that we had. I want to request that we all remember the process that we went through in terms of considering the proposed request for the disapplication to the Secretary of State. And just to remind everyone, there was an extensive consultation with a number of responses, and that was discussed and looked at Budget Working Group and also at Forum. There was the discussion at Budget Working Group, and there was really quite a lengthy and I think a really thorough discussion at Forum itself. So I think we had quite a bit of time in those 3 different fora spent on looking at this item. And that's a really healthy thing to do. And I think that that's a testament to the commitment that we all share in Dudley to put young people at the heart of all of our considerations. And I certainly know from comments made throughout many forum meetings that that is certainly what we all believe in. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean we all agree, and I think that that is, you know, absolutely a healthy thing. And as Helen Ellis has updated us, we all know that the disapplication process, the disapplication request to the Secretary of State has been rejected. We are waiting for feedback on that. But I think that that means that the plan, you know, the plan hasn't gone away. This is an issue that we will be revisiting. We'll be revisiting here at Forum. It will be coming back, and I hope very, very much that we will be able to carry on with constructive dialogue on those issues as we carry on taking a look at the provision of SEND across the borough. Now, I did want to point out that I've reflected a lot myself as chair of Forum about whether or not we could have made the process a little bit clearer, because I do think that there was some discontentment about the views that were very clearly stated through consultation, through budget working group, and also at Forum itself in November about the view not to support, was the overwhelming view, not to support the disapplication process request, but it was submitted. And I just want to remind members of Forum that the process was to gather views, but the paperwork clearly said that it would ultimately be a local authority decision. And the decision by the local authority after taking in those views was to proceed with that request to the Secretary of State. And whilst there was a clear view amongst many people not to agree with that, I do think it's important for us to note that the process was followed correctly. I, as chair, have reflected on whether or not I had done my part in making the process clear, and I have no hesitation in apologizing if I had not, despite the fact that there are notes throughout the reports, the various paperwork, which is very comprehensive, that we receive. And in fact, on page 28 of the minutes, you will see a clear statement there that the views that School Forum did not support the submission of disapplication request was noted. So we're going to try to just learn from this and move forward. And I certainly, as chair, will be making it clear where we're seeking views and where we're actually moving to a vote for actual approval. So I hope that we can all continue with our collaborative work and move forward constructively on that. And as a final point, I just wanted to make clear that there was also some discussion about reserves and the discussion around the balance control mechanism. There's been an email update on that very matter, but if you hadn't caught that email, and just so that everyone is on the same page with this, I just want to remind everyone that no decision yet has been made on the balance control mechanism. So that is still a matter that will come back to Forum, and we'll update. I'm sure that we'll be updated on that in due course. So that's a rather lengthy statement, but I think it was important in the interest of all of our work together collaboratively in Forum to just to get that out there, and so that we can move forward. So that's all from me on that. And I'd now like to just pause if there are any other matters arising. There are no other matters arising from me on those minutes. So colleagues, any other matters arising, please raise your hand, and I'll start with Gareth Burton, please. Just wait, Gareth, we'll just wait till you unmute. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Good evening, Chair. It's a very quick question in relation to your most recent comments about the balance control. You said that no decision had been made as of yet. Have you any idea when a decision is likely to be made? Okay,
I'm going to ask Helen to come in on that for the response.
Sorry, Gareth, we don't. We're waiting for ESFA to respond back to us. So we're hoping it's going to be within the next couple of weeks, but I haven't had any indication as to when we'll hear.
Okay, thank you very much.
As soon as we do, though, I will notify everybody.
That's great. Thanks, Helen. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Okay, wonderful. Any other matters arising? Okay, thank you. We're going to move on to item 7 now, and we'd like to have some feedback from the Head Teachers Consultative Forum, the budget working group. And I believe Jodie Colburn will provide feedback for us. So over to you, Jodie.
Hello, yes, good evening. Thank you, Chair. Budget working group was held on the 19th of January, and I've made some brief notes around the discussions that took place, some of which the points have already been covered during the introductions to tonight's meeting. Helen Ellis gave an update from the Directorate, which included the update that Catherine Driscoll, the new Director for Children's Services, will be joining the local authority on the 22nd of this month. Helen will then return to her substantive post as Service Director. There was also the updates around the disapplication request to the Secretary of State, which we've already covered, and also the request for the balance control mechanism, which has been discussed in the item just previously. Joe Higgins then continued with an update and a presentation around the curriculum-led financial planning tool. This was a tool that was new to myself, so bear with me if my notes are fairly brief. I'm sure Joe may be able to update if needed. But my understanding here was this is a tool that's generally used within secondary provision, and it is used to act as an indicator for staffing efficiency, which looks at a number of indicators, key indicators around contact ratio, so the amount of time teachers are in the classroom delivering provision, curriculum bonus, and works on an average class size. Jo talked at length around how she's used that within some of her schools to look at the model, the staffing model in place, particularly around senior leaders and their the impact that they have on teaching within the classrooms. And she also went on to talk about having a real interest in developing a similar model that may be able to be used for primary settings if they are looking to look at how staffing is used, teachers, but also teaching assistants. I'm sure Jo will be able to update members if they require any more information on that. We then had an update from Jeremy Keeble in terms of the education strategy, with some updates on the key principles, looking at high quality education. So Jeremy updated us on the response to the request from head teachers to join the teaching and learning group. I think it was really positive to hear that we've had a request or an offer from 32 representatives across schools to join that group. Jeremy did talk about that being a fairly large group and how they're going to look to divide that into some substantive groups to be able to really focus on the needs and aspirations of the young people within Dudley. There was an update in terms of the inclusion charter mark that's been led by Dawn Goodhall, and how that's being used to underpin the strategy objective around being fully inclusive within Dudley. Jeremy went on to talk about the continuity between settings around how special schools and their designation is currently being looked at, with a particular focus on SEMH pupils and the number of pupils that are currently out of borough in settings not within Dudley. Jeremy also talked about the self-evaluation review that's been undertaken as part of the local authority, underpinning the local authority's fully coordinated response. It was really quite pleasing, I think, to hear how they are using the self-evaluation framework from the SEND team, the virtual school team, to really put together a plan, an education improvement plan that I know many of us head teachers are familiar with, and that can then be used to kind of drive forward that strategy. We then had an update from Tony and Dawn Goodhall that was looking particularly around SEND. There was an update on staffing, which included a review of the current structure. My notes detail that we now have a management team in place. We have 11 permanent case officers, which for those of us who work in special, but also our mainstream colleagues, is pleasing to hear that we now have some permanent case officers that can support schools. There's also some staff that have been recruited in terms of tribunal and compliance, and also some staff that are undertaking some review of the local offer and the participation within that. There was some financial information shared around business support, with the amount of money that has been actually spent. This did include a £96,000 overspend in the finances that were put aside for those roles, but there was a discussion there around the value for money and the fact that these posts are permanent and will bring some sustainability to Dudley in terms of a solid SEND team that can drive forward with the improvements that are needed. A really comprehensive look at EHCPs. I think it was really pleasing as a special head to see some real quality data that seems to now be being put together around EHCPs within the borough. Real kind of discussion around how those are made up. So we have at present 2,720 active EHCPs within Dudley as of the 31st of December. There was a discussion there around a high number of those really being impacted within the primary sector, and that may be due to a lack of EYFS plans or plans not being put into place perhaps earlier on. There were 470 new EHCPs within 2020 year. And again, there was a discussion there around how FEND supports the graduated approach and the notional funding is used to support before we get to the point of an EHCP. We currently have 4 tribunals that were received, 26 of those are ongoing, and we also have 6 that are being used as part of the national trial. So looking not only at social care, but also education and health. Again, a discussion really around the real need for mediation prior to tribunals. It was noted that each tribunal costs in excess of £10,000 per case. So there was a real discussion there about how we can use mediation to prevent possible tribunals. A question was raised around how those tribunals are based. And it was fed back that they're generally tribunals where parents are requesting a move from a special setting to another special setting, or where they're being asked for a move from a primary to a special. There was a discussion around the number or a spike in EHCP requests. Through my own observations, it seemed to be very much around the transitional period. So looking at end of key stage. And how we get to an end of key stage really, and then have a real surge in possible new requests for EHCPs. I myself requested the number of EHCPs that are driven by school and by school identification, and also the number that are requested by parents. We know that from further or previous discussions that we have a real strong sense of parental preference within Dudley. And I was just interested to know how many of those were driven by parents and how many were driven by schools. Data also showed a high number of pupil premium pupils with the HCPs, 70% being male. And there was a discussion around how this has implications for social care, early help, short breaks, youth offending team, etc., and how that real collaborative working is required in the real essence of an education, health, care plan if we're going to best support those young people. There was a list of schools, the top 10 establishments were presented in terms of those with the most EHCP requests. And from my observations, it showed there the top 10, the highest being Netherton Park with 18, and then the bottom of that list being Jessens and Beacon Hill with 8 EHCP. There was some feedback on the completion dates and the percentage that had been completed within the 20-week statutory period. I think there was acknowledgement that the 25% completion rate was not acceptable. There was a discussion about how the new SEND team were working to improve that, taking on board the COVID exceptions. But there was also a feedback around what was being classed as a D-Day. So every request that was coming in from the 1st of September of last year, that was acknowledged that was at a 100% success rate, and that often the lack of statutory deadlines was because of legacy cases that they were having, the SEND team were having to chase up and follow up. There were some updates in terms of new developments. So Dawn Goodhall presented in terms of the new funding matrix. We know that has been recently, the consultation period for that has been shared with colleagues, and that will run for 6 weeks. It was acknowledged that it's now looking at a very different way of working, in that there'll be a matrix in place for mainstream provision for SEND pupils, with each special school being given a provision-led single cost per pupil. And there were some updates there around why that had come to fruition. The update was brought to a close with a request or a question that was based around the pupil growth fund, and it was acknowledged that there was a school in particular, I believe it was Sledmere, where there'd been an increase in PAN of 30 pupils, and there was just some questions there around why that had come about, why it's been allowed, and did it fall within the pupil growth fund mechanism that was agreed as part of the schools forum. I do understand that a follow-up email has been sent this afternoon, which detailed that in more detail. So hopefully that will be followed up today if there are any further questions. And that's the end of my notes.
Thank you, Jody. That's extremely comprehensive. Thank you very much for that. And just on that last point you were highlighting, Jody, there is agenda item 10 on pupil growth, and yes, the email was circulated prior to this meeting. So thank you for that. Do we have any questions on that feedback from colleagues? Okay, let us move on then to agenda item 8. And I'm going to hand over to Jeremy Keeble, who will take us through the education strategy. And there are some presentation notes available in your paperwork. Jeremy?
Okay, thank you, Chair. Good evening, everybody. Karen's going to share the screen for me, so thank you for that, Karen. I thought it'd be useful because some of you may not have been on previous calls when I've done this update, and I'm tending to do monthly updates, as you can see from the screen. Just to give you a little bit of a background to the education strategy, and that will obviously feed into the updates as I go through what are now embedded as the 6 key principles. So essentially the strategy had its origins back last summer when I first arrived in Dudley. And the intention was to put in place, as it says on the screen, a framework that, if you like, scaffolded everything else that goes on in schools, but more particularly in terms of what the local authority does in collaboration with schools and academies. Up to then, and you know, I've got to say this politely, but there didn't seem to be that kind of real sense of what we were trying to do as a borough. There didn't seem to be, and different academies, different schools voice it in different ways, but there wasn't that vision, that mission statement, that real stated intent of what we were trying to do. So the idea of the strategy was to frame everything else so that existing projects could be linked together and any new work was seen in a context, so everything held together coherently. The other basis really was to proceed initially to really build strong relationships with schools, with academies, and also across our own services, and really develop a culture. And I'll talk about that in a minute going forward, but develop a collaborative culture in terms of how we work as a local authority, how we work with our maintained schools, how we work with our trusts to make sure we're all supporting what is essentially the key focus of what we're doing, which is all the children and young people in Dudley. So if we flick on to the next slide, Karen, please, and I'll take you through. So essentially there are 6 key principles. And again, if you've not heard this before, the idea of key principles was to make sure, particularly in the secondary phase, where we've got a number of schools, in fact 15 of our 19 providers in the secondary phase are in trusts, they're not maintained. The idea of framing this around key principles rather than something that was really bullet pointed and very prescriptive is obviously we respect our trusts have their own ways of curriculum models and educational philosophies, and we wanted to make sure that they can buy into this whilst having the sort of independence to proceed on their own way that they want within their own trusts. So we framed it around 6 key principles. The first one was about taking responsibility. So that's about working as a borough for, as I said just now, all the children and young people, and have that same high aspiration for all of the children, regardless of which provision that they've been in. So, or are in rather. We've worked very extensively meeting with head teachers individually and collectively across the term, the autumn term, and also into the new spring term. And that, as I said, has continued to advance the agenda, but also really support that collaborative working. And the real driver is to be transparent and to communicate strongly and work with our head teachers. as was mentioned earlier, I think Jodie was mentioning, because I gave this very similar presentation to the budget working group. We put out just before Christmas, it was literally the last week before the Christmas festive break, at the end of a long COVID year, that we were looking to set up a teaching and learning group to work, as I said, collaboratively with schools. And I don't know what I really expected. I was thinking if we got half a dozen people to work with a few of us in the local authority. I was actually quite staggered when it ended up at 32 requests or proposals from schools and academies to work with us. We had a meeting, Chair, I can update slightly on this, last week, at the end of last week, and we managed to get, I think, 26 of those people together, because there'll always be any occasional apologies. And we've actually decided now, because of the size of that group, again, as Jodie mentioned earlier, that we can't really proceed. I mean, it's okay in a forum such as this, but where you want to have real collaborative working, I personally think, and we agreed that 30 is too large a group. So we subdivided it down, and we decided as a group that we're going to work on a number of areas. One is around looking at the post-COVID landscape, if you can use that phrase, and heads and academy principals are very keen to build on as we hopefully come out of lockdown at some point and more children come back in, because we're all very aware that education is changing and the ways that we teach and the way that children learn may change, particularly in terms of some of the messages we've learned from remote learning, and I'll come on to that in a minute. So there was a group looking at that. There was another group that's looking more at data-driven provision, looking and interrogating the performance of schools. And also I'll mention in a minute, Chair, our CEF, and it will link into interrogating our CEF. There was a third group that are looking at transition, which is primarily from primary to secondary, but we might be looking at early years transition as well. And there was another group that we're looking at sharing some of the good practice around subject specialist work or leadership skills. And at the moment, we are literally collating those requests from heads. We'll look to be able to meet again next couple of weeks and start those different groups. But at the moment, we're just collating the requests from heads. It's quite interesting, actually, Chair, when they're coming in, some heads are actually asking to sit on 3 of the 4 groups. So again, that's really good in terms of evidence that we're putting out an agenda that schools and academies want to work with us. Another piece of work that's going on very actively is work with the CEO of our multi-academy trusts. We've got all of our CEOs, or the vast majority, together last Friday, all the primary and secondary, and obviously as some are CEOs across both phases. We're looking to do something collaborative again around alternative provision. It's quite an early stage of the work, but we're looking to make sure that we've got something sustainable. I'll talk about our own inclusive pathways in a moment, but the idea of that piece of work is to look at a provision that links together all the expertise in our trusts, as well as what we do across our maintained sector, to make sure we've got a really proactive sense of supporting children. And the focus there is to identify children who are at risk of exclusion and put that intensive support, that early identification, early assessment, so that we avoid, where at all possible, any exclusions at all. In terms of the second one, making sure all of our schools and academies are fully inclusive. We've been through a lot of work as our education managers team. We meet every Monday now, and we have a risk register, which is not about risk assessment from a health and safety perspective, but we just have, if you like, a RAG rating of schools in terms of not the urgency, but the necessity to support schools in a sort of correlated way. And some might be nearer to an Ofsted inspection. Some of them might have new leadership teams. Some may have capacity issues, and some of them might be in requires improvement, and so on. So we went through some of the schools that were in those sorts of areas from an inclusive perspective, discussed with all of our teams, all of our inclusion teams, including visually impaired teams, hearing impaired, looking at all of our other services, Dudley Virtual School, admissions, looking at all the other teams that support within education outcomes. And then we fed back to the heads, again, mainly around an inclusion agenda. And again, that was a really productive way of working, in that we had a two-way conversation and made heads aware of what we were doing for them, but also had the chance for them to feed back and say, actually, this from a local authority perspective is great, but could we also tweak this? So that's an encouraging piece of work, and we're continuing that. We're looking in the next few weeks to do a similar piece of work around what we do to support some of our academies, and we'll be starting to roll those discussions out and involve heads and CEOs from the trusts in those discussions, because we're obviously aware that we've got Dudley's children in some of our academies. Obviously they're all Dudley's children, and we want to make sure the support is there for the academies and the children as well. Inclusive pathways, I'll come on to that in a bit more detail in a moment, but we're starting to roll that out now, and that links into the work with the CEOs above. And also, this is slightly delayed because we want to make sure it's right when we get the launch, but we're looking to roll out a wellbeing charter mark, an inclusion charter mark. It probably won't be January now because obviously been delayed by COVID. We need to have children in schools in larger numbers to actually do this meaningfully. But that's a collaborative piece of work again, and we're already getting schools coming forward before we've even got the launch date, which is also quite encouraging. And the plan is to identify a few schools in each township that will pilot that for us so we can get the model right before we launch it across the borough with every provider. In terms of the next slide, please, Karen. The third one is about continuity. Again, this is the same sort of philosophy that hopefully runs through this, about working together, taking collective responsibility. And we are continuing to review what is the situation in terms of linkage between our mainstream schools, our special schools, our AP provision, and so on. So we are reviewing designations. Jodie said earlier, we are very aware that the deficit or the lack of places is for children with SEMH as their primary need on their EHCPs. So we're looking to create some extra capacity, possibly redesignating some of our special schools. We're not looking to increase the number of special places within Dudley, but we do need to make sure they're responsive to the needs of the children. We're also, as part of that, incorporating a review of our bases, our various bases, SEMH bases, our speech and language bases, and so on, again, to make sure that it's demand led and we've got the right number of places for the children with the respective needs. And we're also at the early stages of just discussing inclusion centres. And this is where, if the idea is to make our mainstream schools more inclusive, to just give them some additional provision. I've used this, and this is an idea I've taken from a previous local authority I was in, where the presumption is that children would be in mainstream provision the majority of the time, but this might be for children who are possibly on the autism spectrum, who might just need at certain times during break or days when they were not regulated, just somewhere to go for a couple of lessons before they're able to re-engage with mainstream lessons. So that's something where we're looking at, and I was having a discussion with a couple of people last week about taking that forward. And it links in, Chair, with themes that we've already talked about reducing out of borough spend. If we can steer more of our mainstream schools to be more inclusive, and I'll be careful how I say that, because we have got many of our mainstream schools that are very inclusive, but obviously there's a piece of work to be travelled with some of them. But if we can make sure that we meet more of the needs of our youngsters within the local authority without going to costly out of borough provision, then obviously from a financial perspective, that's really, really where we want to go. There will clearly be always youngsters whose needs are so complex that possibly they do need to go to more specialist provision than we have within the borough, but we shouldn't be putting children out of the borough because we just don't have capacity. So that's a piece of work that we're looking to move forward on. The fourth one is about reducing exclusions and the movement of children around our schools. Often what happens if a child is excluded once, there's a high linkage. Some of those children excluded a second time and they continue to move around. So again, it's about taking responsibility, making sure that we have support systems for our schools. The inclusive pathways that I mentioned earlier is a supportive system that we're just starting to roll out, and it links in with some of the work with the CEOs, making sure when schools do get into that crisis situation that they can call on us and we can provide some kind of support to try and make sure the child doesn't get excluded in the first place. It's about being proactive and preemptive and making sure that the schools have got a triage of people who can go in and support with whatever the particular issues are. And so we've had collective discussions as well with schools where there are high levels of fixed term exclusion. And again, in the culture we're trying to work with, this was mainly a primary school group. It wasn't seen by the heads. It's quite interesting. It wasn't seen as the local authority putting them on the rack and asking them why their exclusions were so high. What it generated was a whole lot of good ideas coming from the schools as well as from ourselves about the way we can work together. Simple little ideas, for example, if a child has to unfortunately have a fixed term exclusion, if it's right for that child and it can be supported, could they not serve the day in another school down the road rather than go home? Because we all know as heads that often if children are excluded, it's not always seen as a punishment. They get up late and ride their bikes around them, and it's not an absolute, but that's often what happens. Whereas if you can keep the child in provision in another school, so that is something we're looking to work towards. And also, we're being much more transparent, Chair, the last bullet there, with the data I put out. I think it was last week. I lose the track of time sometimes, but we put out all of our data again last week, our inclusion data to schools, just to keep them up to date with the number of EHCs in each school, the number of fixed term exclusions as a percentage of roll and permanent exclusions, just so we're being absolutely transparent. We did get a little bit of a response to that, particularly around the EHC. So if anybody wants to take this back to colleagues who've raised that, the data was correct as of the 31st of December last year. So we are conscious 1 or 2 schools got in touch and said it's not quite right, but possibly there will have been changes to that data in the last month. And the very last slide, Karen, please. There we go. This is about coordinating of our own teams, because I think it's really important that we have a strong collective way of working when we go out to support our schools. And we engaged, again, Jodie touched on this earlier, we are currently engaged in a full self-evaluation of what we are doing. We're using the Ofsted leadership management descriptors, which those of you ahead will be familiar with, because we feel that that's the best way of evaluating what we do. The model of a local authority working with schools now from a school improvement perspective has changed hugely in the last 10, 15 years. We're not in a situation where we were sort of the early 2000s where the majority of schools were maintained. So we need to bear that in mind and those relationships. And we need to also look at the fact that in a lot of local authority teams like Dudley, we don't have a huge amount of capacity to go out and do dozens and dozens of lesson observations. So largely our work is done by influencing and working with senior leaders. So what we've done, and we'll be sharing this in due course, we've reframed the leadership management judgment. So for example, the first one in the Ofsted framework is about the school and governors have high aspirations for children and young people. We framed that as the local authority has. And so we're working on those and we're using those to evaluate how we interface and influence schools and their leadership teams particularly. We're also, as part of that, mapping all the work that we do, and we engage with our individual schools. And I won't go through a long list now, Chair, but there's a huge range of projects now, from Teach First through to work with the violence reduction units, the education endowment fund, the teaching and learning group, the remote working group. There's a large number, and well over 50% of schools are engaged with us on one or more projects. So that again is really, really encouraging. As part of the CEF, we are going to involve heads in giving us some feedback that may well dovetail into one of the teaching and learning groups. And we will be then from the CEF producing a detailed improvement plan, which will drive all of the work going forward. And again, will involve schools and academies in feeding into that. It's really important, as I want to stress throughout this, that we want to be collaborative and build those relationships. And obviously incorporated within all of this is the work that Tony's team are doing so well in terms of the response to the written statement of action, all of the SEND work. And sitting behind the CEF for education will be the CEF for SEND and the CEF for our virtual school. So the idea is to link it all together. So we've got one central document, the 9 areas, the 9 descriptors for the leadership and management judgments, and we can have all the appendices behind, so everything is in one place in the same way that a school would work from its CEF to its improvement plan. And the final one is hopefully what I'm doing now, which is communicating regularly. This very same presentation I mentioned earlier, it did go to budget working group, Chair. It's gone to secondary heads, it's going to special heads, it's going to primary forum. So the idea is to keep everybody fully informed of what we're doing, again, in that way of working, communicating, collaborating with our schools. And as again, I've put on the bottom there, the CEF and the school improvement plan will be shared as part of that. So in summary, I think we've come a long way in 6 or 7 months in terms of the relationships we're building, but obviously now we're at the point where we can really put that platform and use it to generate some real improvement in collaboration with our schools and our academies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeremy. Indeed, quite a bit of work going on there. Thank you very much for that presentation. Colleagues, any questions or comments for Jeremy? Okay, we will move on to agenda item 9, which is the dedicated schools grant budget process. There are papers to accompany this. I'd like to just make an introduction here before I hand over to Stacey, who will take us through this item. And you'll note, colleagues, that the purpose of this particular item is an update on the DSG budget process. But there's also an item of approval, which we will need to deal with. So I'd like to draw your attention on page 6 of this paper, according to my pagination numbers, under the recommendations heading. So item 3, under recommendations, you will see the third bullet point, which refers to an approval of the minimum funding guarantee for 2021-22. So that approval, the approval of the MFG, will also be part of the purpose of this item. So what I'll do is I'm going to hand over to Stacey, who will take us through the content, and I'm sure Stacey will be happy to answer any questions that you may have. And then the update will be noted, and we will then move over to a show of approval or not, as the case may be. So I hope that process is clear. Okay, over to you, Stacey.
Lovely, thank you, Chair. Okay, then, so picking up on that point then, just to start out on the report, the way I'm going to approach the report is I'll just talk through the headline changes, just to make you aware, and also inform you of the key points really that will help you make that decision around approving the minimum funding guarantee and the APT pro forma tool. So what I'll do is I'll go through the main points first, and then I'll come back to the appendix, which Karen kindly circulated before the meeting this evening. So what we have been able to do at the point where we issued the report, we hadn't been able to calculate all of the school budgets through the APT. We were still working on that information. So what we did know is that the ESFA tell us that we have to set at least a plus 0.5% per pupil increase for the minimum funding guarantee. Now, what we've been able to do is we can actually afford to set it at 1.26%. So that's the decision tonight, is to confirm that you're happy with that. What that also means is that we've been able to mirror the national funding formula as closely as possible, and we have not capped any gains for those schools that would have gained. So that's why it's affordable at 1.26%. So that's the first point. So if I can just draw your attention just down the report to the section on the early years block. So on section 10, I've just got a few points to make there. And as I say, we'll talk about the IPT in more detail at the end of the report. So just to make you aware that the units of resource, the hourly rates for 3- and 4-year-old nursery children have actually increased to £4.44 per hour for next year. And we've also had the disadvantaged 2-year-old hourly rate increase to £5.40. The disability access funding remains the same at £615 per eligible pupil, and the amount of funding for the pupil premium for early years, it remains the same as last year as well, at 53p per hour. We've had transitional supplementary funding, an estimate there for our only maintained nursery school, and that's estimated at £316,000 for next year. Now, as part of the early years block, we are required to have a pass-through rate that we must achieve as a local authority, whereby we must pass through 95% of the funding over to providers. And based on our estimates at the moment, we are well within that target of only retaining 5% at the centre to fund those services that support the early years provision. So that's good to note. One thing I do need to pass comment on is just under the section where it references the SCN Inclusion Fund. I must note that I have made a mistake there on the report, and I've got a bit of a typo. That reference should be the 2nd of March 2021 Schools Forum meeting, not the 23rd of February. So apologies for that. So moving on to the high needs block, the main thing that I want to draw your attention to around what has changed is around the planned places and the ESFA return that we do there. For those young people that the ESFA funds institutes directly for. We've had a return that we submitted back on the 13th of November, and we have a net additional 57 places across 5 different providers there. So that will have a negative impact in terms of the recruitment to the DSG, and that is partly why these figures are provisional at this stage. We're estimating that we will have 176k deduction for those post-16 places, and a deduction of £46,000 in relation to academies. And we're hoping that we will get an update for that by the 30th of March meeting to give you a final position there. So I just want to make that clear to you. If I then draw you to your attention to table 1, this sets out the provisional allocations there by individual blocks. And you will see that those figures that are in sort of italics are the ones where we've got changes to pupil numbers that will impact on the early years block there. But provisionally, our schools block and the APT pro forma that I'll talk about in a moment equates to £226.5 million worth of funding that's coming there on the schools block. We have just over £2 million worth of central schools block for next year. Our provisional early years block is £19.3 million, and then our high needs block is at just over 40.155 million pounds there. So overall, Dudley's DSG provisional allocation is just over 288 million pounds. So it's I won't go through all the individual lines there. I'm assuming that you've read that and you can see where those figures have changed in terms of those units of resource that I've flagged up really. So before I jump onto the APT, I just want to take you down to the pupil premium and the national copyright licensing, just to make you aware there. So sections 17 and 18 of the report. With regards to pupil premium, the ESFA have confirmed that those units of resource won't change for this year, so they'll be the same as what you had for 2021. And we are hoping that we will get final allocations for next year's budget to be provided normally by June. Not sure whether they'll come through in that time, given the situation with COVID this year again, but we can hope that that's when they'll come through. With regards to the national copyright licensing, we have a confirmed charge of £218,000 there for next year, and that is held centrally within Children's Services Directorate, and we pay that bill directly on behalf of schools, and that budget is topsized from the schools block, which is the same as previous years. So with regards to timetable, before we jump onto that decision around the MFG, there's just in table 2 that kind of sets out for you where we are in terms of what the plans are. So we hope to submit to yourselves as schools by the 28th of February all of the budget shares for maintain mainstream schools, pupil referral units and special schools as well. So we're aiming to do that, and then by the end of March there's the deadline for confirmation of the estimated early years funding allocation to providers. So those are the main things there, and what you'll see is that we still the allocations for the early years block continue to get amended based on the pupil census data in the summer of this year and then also the summer of next year. So there's quite a lag there with early years, but again that's as it has been. So if I can take you on to the APT, the email that that Karen circulated earlier for me. This is an extract of what we submitted to the ESFA last week, and there's just a few points that I want to make out to you in terms of helping you make that decision around the 1.26% MFG. So what we've been able to do is we've demonstrated that the schools block has increased by an additional 16.5 million from last year to this year. Of that, 9.5 million relates to the teachers' pay and pensions grant. So that related to quite a big chunk of that. But what we can do is we can afford to allow all schools to see a per pupil increase. And as I say, we will be capping no gains for any of those schools that should receive gains. So that is good news. And we've mirrored the NFF guidelines as closely as we possibly can. This means that MFG is at 1.26%, and that 28 schools currently within Dudley are at the MFG level. So that is obviously lower than had we have sort of tried to fund a higher MFG and cap gains. So that's the position there. So what we have got is a minimum per pupil increase for primary schools up to £4,180 per pupil, which was 3,750 last year. And for secondary schools, it's £5,415 compared to £5,000 last year, so that has increased. We've also seen the lump sum increase up to 118,000 compared to 114,000 last year as well. So what we have is that the methodology that the ESFA have based deprivation funding has changed since last year as well. So they're actually devolving more funding based on the deprivation factor now compared to in previous years as well. And really the final point to say is that you'll notice that growth fund is at 751k, and Laura will talk through that shortly in terms of the next agenda item. So really, in a nutshell, that's everything that I want to say in terms of the APT and the report. I'm happy to take any questions, and I'll do my best to answer those. But really, it's the decision around the MFG level, and if Forum are happy to support that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Stacey. So we'll pause before we move on in terms of looking at approval for the MFG for questions. And I'm going to begin with Christine Finnegan, please.
Chair, can I just ask, the decisions that we're asked to make tonight on that decision of the APT, is it, like you said earlier, the process is to gather views, but the LA would ultimately make the decision? The decision will be the local authorities no matter what we say tonight.
Okay, thank you. The way that the Constitution works in terms of the decision for the MFG on the APT pro forma is that it needs to have political buy-in for councillors within within Dudley, and it also needs to have schools forum buy-in as well. Unfortunately, the way that the process works is that we have a deadline in terms of submitting the APT pro forma. So it's really sort of the timing doesn't help in terms of having a debate around the different levels of MFG that could be applied. But we, as the local authority, have kind of done some different models, which this seems to be the fairest model in terms of applying the funding rates and MFG and the gains not being capped. And it mirrors exactly what the DfE expect us to do as a local authority if we were running through the national funding formula as well.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Stacey. Any further questions? I don't see any hands raised for further questions, so we'll move to looking at views on the MFG. So, colleagues, we now need to consider whether to approve the MFG guarantee for 2021-2022, and it's set at 1.26%, as Stacey has indicated, which is the amendment in terms of what you see on your paperwork as detailed in the Dudley's Authority Pro Forma tool, the APT. So what I'd like to do is to first ask if you are not in agreement, so if you do not agree with approving the MFG, would you please raise your hand? I think that will be easier for us to take a look at numbers for those, first of all, who don't agree, and then subsequently I'll ask for those who abstain. So if you are in agreement, you can just rest, you don't need to do anything. Okay, so let's start with those who are not in agreement of supporting the MFG as set at 1.26%. So please raise your hand if you do not agree. Okay, I do not see any hands raised. Karen will correct me if I'm wrong. Let us move on to any abstentions to this vote. Abstentions. Okay, and again, I do not see any hands raised. Thank you. Okay, I believe that concludes this item. Thank you. Thank you, Stacy. And moving on to item 10, we're moving on to, been mentioned a couple of times throughout the course of this meeting. Item 10 is the pupil growth fund. And the purpose of this is we're going to be noting this information. So I'd like to hand over to Laura, please, to take us through.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So this is to provide forum with an update on the latest financial information regarding the pupil growth fund contingency for this financial year 2021, and also an update on the allocation for 21-22. So can I take you to paragraph 12 initially? So that's on page 21. So what that sets out for you is this financial year's growth fund allocation, which is at £935,000. So if we then look at table 2, and I'd also like to note that there is an error on this table. So the funding allocated should read 2021, not 1920. So I just wanted to flag that to everyone. So what this table does is it looks at the allocations made to schools for 2021, and you can see that there's 198 pupils funded as per their eligibility criteria. And that translates to £544,688. And you can see that that's made up of 6 schools in total. And that follows the funding methodology and criteria that was agreed at the Schools Forum meeting back in October 2020. So table 3 on page 23 notes that funding criteria and methodology in detail. So earlier, Jodie gave feedback on budget working group, and what I wanted to do at this point was just give you a little bit more information, and that's based on the email and the feedback that we've sent through. So the question that was raised, Jodie was correct, it was in relation to Sledmere School, and it was particularly in relation to the number of pupils and the fact that they had received funding or were due to receive funding for 2021 in addition to prior years. And what we've actually done is we've looked at the funding methodology just to be really, really clear on this. And you can see that on table 3, it does actually state on the first point under the methodology section, it says additional funding will be made available in relation to additional pupils admitted to the relevant school in reception and year 7, as recorded on October school census. And then it says until such time as the increase is reflected in all year groups. So in the case of Sledmere, what we were doing was ensuring that that increase had fed through and was reflected, filtering through to all age groups. So we anticipate that this is the last year that Sledmere will receive that funding, because that increase should have filtered through by the end of this financial year. So I just wanted to make that clear to all forum members. So going back to paragraph 13, you will see that there is an underspend for this financial year of £390,000. The intention there is to add that to the DSG contingency reserve for this financial year at year end, and that will be up for further review. So that's what I wanted to say for 2021. So taking you to paragraph 16, you'll see that Stacey mentioned in her report, she referenced growth fund. And we just wanted to make it clear here that the growth fund allocation for 21-22 is £751,274. So I think that's everything that I wanted to cover, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for Laura, colleagues? I don't see any hands raised for questions, so I believe that that will conclude that item, having noted the information presented. Thank you for that. Okay, we're moving on now to our final agenda item this evening, which is the Children's Directorate update. This is a verbal item, and I'd like to hand over to Helen Ellis.
Okay, thank you, Chair. All I've really got in terms of an update, and Jodie updated everybody in terms of just let everybody know that our new director, Catherine Driscoll, will be starting with us on the 22nd of February, of which means that I will then be going back to my substantive post, which is the Service Director for Education, Send and Early Help. That's the only update I've got for Schools Forum this evening.
Thank you. So we will be welcoming our new colleague at our next meeting in March.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I've got Jill Belcher. Would you like to come in, please, Jill?
Yeah, just wanted to note our thanks to Helen. You know, she's obviously been in a challenging time, and I just think we should perhaps record our thanks to Helen for the work she's done in her interim role, and I'm sure she's looking forward to perhaps handing things back over and being able to do one job. So thank you, Helen, and thank you for your openness and transparency with us all.
Thank you, it's appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jill. And I'd just like to add my thanks, I'm sure, on behalf of our colleagues in Forum. Helen, you've been so positive, and all the time, and many hard times we've had over the last months, and you've been so positive and so constructive, and you're so solution orientated. It's really a breath of fresh air. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. I think that will conclude our meeting this evening. So a bit of a shorter one this evening as a bonus in a dark January night. And that concludes us at 7:08 p.m. Thank you for everyone who's attended this evening. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your contributions. They're, as always, much appreciated. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Chair.
Thank you.